Man gets his new housekeeper pregnant and fires her. What she did 10 years later left everyone speechless. The sun began to rise over Mexico City, painting the sky with shades of orange and gold. Lucia, already awake for hours, stood by the window of the tiny apartment she shared with her mother, Teresa, and her 2 siblings. The space was modest, but it overflowed with love and a quiet sense of duty. A soft cough echoed from Teresa's room, breaking the stillness. Her health had been deteriorating steadily since the devastating diagnosis months earlier, a severe lung disease that required costly treatments, an impossible burden for a family like theirs. In the small living room, Adriana, her 13-year-old sister, was getting ready for school. Lucas, the youngest, at just 8, was finishing his breakfast. Lucia watched it all in silence, a quiet determination etched across her face. She knew the day ahead would be grueling. Hours spent on overcrowded buses, followed by demanding work at the Montero mansion. A place so vast and cold, it seemed like another world entirely. But Lucia didn't have the luxury of giving up. Life kept throwing obstacles her way, and she couldn't afford to stumble. Walking through the enormous gates of the mansion each morning, Lucia was struck by a mix of awe and unease. The sprawling gardens, the glittering crystal chandeliers, and the extravagant furniture, so costly it could feed a family for months, belonged to a life utterly foreign to her. For Lucia, the mansion wasn't a home, but a stage, and she was nothing more than an invisible extra. The Monteros wielded power with ease, their privilege evident in every gesture. Fernando, the stern patriarch, ruled both his household and business empire with an icy precision. Elena, his wife, was absorbed in her own world of social engagements and beauty routines, rarely sparing a glance for the staff. To her, Lucia and the others might as well not exist. Miguel, the eldest son, mirrored his father's indifference, while Camilla, the spoiled teenage daughter, seemed to revel in creating chaos. Her arrogance turned Lucia's daily tasks into a minefield. Lucia observed the Monteros from a distance, as if watching a play where she had no lines, no agency. One day, while cleaning Fernando's office, she felt his gaze linger on her for a moment too long. It made her stomach twist uneasily, and she quickly returned to her work, pretending not to notice. Something about that moment set her on edge, and her instincts told her to remain cautious. The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Eleanor's complaints about trivial matters stung, and Camilla's petty games wore on Lucia's resolve. Yet, in fleeting moments, she found solace. During short breaks in the mansion's garden, she would sit among the flowers and let herself breathe. Those were the times when she thought of her family. Lucas's mischievous grin, Adriana's resilience, and Teresa's frail but steadfast encouragement. They were her anchor. One evening, as Lucia set the table for dinner, she overheard a conversation between Eleanor and Fernando. They were discussing an extravagant event they planned to impress foreign investors. Lucia tried not to listen, but Elena's words cut through her like a knife. These people who work for us don't understand real value. It's as if they live on another planet. The words echoed in Lucia's mind, stinging with their cruelty and reinforcing the chasm between her world and theirs. But as she carried on with her duties, something stirred within her. No matter how invisible she seemed to them, her love for her family was real and unshakable. It was her strength, her reason to keep moving forward. Lucia knew she didn't belong in the Monteros' glittering, indifferent universe. But in the quiet corners of her heart, she carried something far more precious, the unyielding determination to fight for her family's future. And that, she reminded herself, was worth more than all the luxury in the world. Fernando let out a brief laugh, but the iciness in his tone drained it of any real humor. "They don't live on another planet," he said. Lucia felt her face flush, an unsettling mix of shame and anger rising within her. Even though she was practically invisible to the Monteros, those words hit her like a silent punishment. To them, she was nothing more than a tool, a cog in their polished machine, easily replaced if it ever failed. But that wasn't the worst of it. Fernando's piercing stares and cryptic remarks left her feeling exposed, as though she were constantly being watched. Sometimes he seemed overly polite, offering unexpected compliments or dragging conversations longer than necessary. Like the night he stopped in the hallway, his eyes lingering on her for a few seconds too long. It made her skin crawl, but she pushed the feeling aside, determined to carry on. Lucia's life wasn't easy, but she had no choice but to keep going. Her family depended on her. The Monteros, with all their coldness, were her only means of keeping a roof over their heads and paying for her mother's treatment. So, despite the growing unease gnawing at her insides, she moved forward, her options too few to entertain the luxury of doubt. By the time night fell, exhaustion weighed heavily on Lucia. Yet, as tired as she was, she still found the strength to sit beside her mother. Teresa, frail but endlessly grateful, murmured soft words of thanks. Adriana, her eyes shining with dreams of becoming a lawyer, flipped through the pages of a borrowed book. Lucas, lost in his playful world, tinkered with the small toy Lucia had bought him with her hard-earned wages. For a fleeting moment, she felt happiness spark in her chest. The smiles of her family reminded her why she endured it all. But beneath that flicker of joy, a growing discomfort lingered. A shadow, born from Fernando's unnerving behavior, creeping deeper into her thoughts. The longer she sat there, the more it spread, like the darkness of the night slowly seeping into her life. When the clock struck midnight, Lucia finally closed her eyes. She promised herself she would face whatever came her way. For her family, she would endure anything, even the most challenging trials. But something felt different that night. The Montero mansion was unusually still, its silence thick and unsettling, as if something was about to happen. As always, Lucia was the last to leave the kitchen. She double-checked every detail, ensuring the dishes were spotless, the counters gleaming, her work done with the precision of someone who couldn't afford mistakes. The house was eerily quiet, the ticking of the clock, the only sound breaking the stillness. Just as she finished changing out of her uniform and prepared to leave, a familiar voice echoed from the corridor. "Lucia, come to my office. I need to speak with you." She froze for a moment. Fernando's voice was cool, almost commanding, but not enough to set off immediate alarm bells. Taking a steadying breath, she straightened her posture and walked toward the office. Whatever it was, she would have to face it head-on. Fernando sat behind his imposing leather desk, the dim lighting casting deep shadows that obscured his expression. His gaze was sharp and deliberate, as if he were studying her every move. "Please sit," he said, motioning briefly to the chair in front of him. Lucia hesitated but complied, lowering herself onto the edge of the seat. She sat stiffly, her back straight, every muscle tense as she braced herself for whatever was to come. Something about this meeting felt different, heavier, and deep down, she knew this was a moment she wouldn't forget. He started the conversation in an oddly calm and almost friendly tone, asking about her mother's health, her siblings, and how things were at home. The sudden shift made him seem almost fatherly, and Lucia answered cautiously, unsure how to respond. "You're very hard-working, Lucia, much more than others in your position. It's admirable." She attempted a polite smile, but something in his gaze triggered a warning deep inside her. Fernando, always so controlled and imposing, was acting strange, and his apparent kindness felt anything but genuine. She knew he was calculating, and this newfound warmth hid something darker, something dangerous. Before she could fully process the moment, he leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with an unsettling weight that froze her in place. "You know, people like me have the power to change lives, don't you?" His words were smooth, but each one cut like a finely sharpened blade. They invaded her space, filling the room with an oppressive tension. She instinctively tried to step back, to create some distance, but her body felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed. The office no longer felt like just a room. It was a cage, tightening around her with every passing second. When he finally stepped away, Lucia left the office on unsteady legs, her steps faltering as she made her way down the corridor. The house, usually cold but tolerable, now felt suffocating. By the time she reached the bathroom, she could no longer hold it together. She locked the door, leaned against the sink and tried to catch her breath, but the tears came fast and unbidden, streaking down her face in hot streams. Something irreversible had just happened, something that would mark her forever. On the crowded bus ride home, Lucia's thoughts were a tangled mess, each replay of the scene in Fernando's office like a cruel, looping film. The weight of what had happened pressed down on her chest, threatening to crush her completely. She wanted to scream, to run far away from that house and never look back. But reality was an unrelenting anchor. She couldn't afford to leave. Her mother depended on her. Her siblings needed her. Without that job, how would they survive? How would she pay for the rent, the medicine, the food? The pain of her circumstances mingled with her growing sense of entrapment, making her feel like she was drowning in her own helplessness. When she finally reached home, Lucia summoned every ounce of strength she had to hide the storm raging within. She hugged her mother, smiled at Adriana, and sat beside Lucas to help him with his homework. They needed her to be steady, to be strong, to give them a sense of normalcy. Even as she felt like she was falling apart inside, she clung to that role for their sake. Later that night, in the tiny room she shared with Adriana, the walls closed in around her. Alone in the dark, she finally let the tears flow. It was a quiet, shuddering release, a painful mixture of fear, anger, and sorrow. She knew she couldn't escape her reality, no matter how much she wished things were different. The weight of her trauma was hers alone to carry, buried deep where no one else could see. The next morning, as she walked toward the Montero mansion, her heart felt heavier than ever. Crossing through those gates again felt like stepping into a sentence she hadn't agreed to serve. The house loomed ahead, its cold grandeur mocking her. It wasn't just a place, it was a cycle of pain and submission that she couldn't yet figure out how to break. But with no other options, she pushed forward, even as a part of her longed for the courage to find another way. The walls of the Montero mansion, once just a symbol of class disparity, now felt like they were closing in on Lucia, heavy with memories she desperately wanted to forget. They seemed to press down on her, suffocating, carrying the weight of moments she wished had never happened. Each day, she did her best to avoid Fernando's gaze, but it wasn't easy. He acted as though nothing had transpired, as if her pain was inconsequential. That nonchalance made everything worse. Every casual gesture, every word spoken with unsettling normalcy was a reminder of the control he held. Lucia fought to maintain her composure, but the knot in her throat was a constant companion, ready to unravel at any moment. Meanwhile, Helena continued her endless demands, oblivious to the storm inside Lucia. To her, Lucia was just another faceless employee, replaceable and invisible. Camilla, the teenage daughter, was relentless, finding faults in everything: a wrinkle in her clothes, a missed spot in the cleaning, or some imagined oversight. Lucia bore it all in silence, her mind distant, grappling with the aftermath of what had happened during that fateful evening. One afternoon, as she prepared to leave, Lucia paused at the kitchen door. For a fleeting moment, she considered walking away, leaving it all behind, disappearing into the city and never coming back. But then, the image of her frail mother lying in bed and the innocent smiles of her siblings flashed before her eyes. She couldn't abandon them. No matter how much she longed to escape, they needed her. That night, standing alone in the bathroom, she stared at her reflection in the small mirror. With a trembling voice, she forced herself to speak aloud. "I can endure this. I have to." It was a painful promise, but one she knew she had to keep. Lucia realized she needed a plan. She couldn't stay in that house forever, but she also couldn't risk her family's survival. For now, her only option was to swallow her pain and take it one day at a time. Yet deep down, she knew that the consequences of Fernando's actions were only beginning, and his shadow seemed to loom larger each passing day, threatening everything she held dear. The days dragged on with agonizing slowness. Every moment in the mansion felt like an eternity. Lucia completed her duties mechanically, but her body was wearing down, not just from the physical labor, but from the emotional toll Fernando had inflicted on her. A persistent unease gnawed at her, and soon physical symptoms began to surface. She felt nauseous, dizzy, and constantly drained. At first, she thought it might be a passing illness, but as the weeks went by, she could no longer ignore the signs. Something was wrong. One evening, alone at home, Lucia finally gathered the courage to confront her fears. She quietly purchased a pregnancy test, hiding it from her mother and siblings. Her hands shook as she waited for the result, her heartbeat loud and fast in her ears. When 2 faint lines appeared, confirming her pregnancy, the world seemed to collapse around her. She sank to the bathroom floor, tears streaming silently down her face. She felt overwhelmed by a tidal wave of fear, anger, and despair. What was she supposed to do now? How could she raise a child in her current circumstances? How would she explain this to her already frail mother, who relied so heavily on her? And the most haunting question of all, Fernando. The next morning, Lucia returned to work, her mind made up to confront him. She didn't have a clear plan or know what she wanted to achieve, but she couldn't carry the burden alone any longer. As the household bustled with activity, Lucia waited for her moment. When Helena and Camilla left for a social event, the house fell quiet. She made her way to Fernando's office, her heart pounding as she approached. He looked up, surprised to see her enter unannounced. His expression quickly shifted back to his usual cold indifference. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice sharp and impatient, as if her presence were a mere inconvenience. Lucia closed the door behind her and took a deep breath, steadying herself for the storm she was about to face. Lucia sat on the edge of the chair, her trembling hands gripping its sides as if the pressure could steady her. Her voice, though shaky, carried an unyielding resolve as she finally broke the suffocating silence. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, Fernando remained quiet, his expression unreadable. Then his eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle shift that made the air in the room heavier. Rising from his chair with deliberate slowness, he took a step toward her, each movement laced with tension. "That's not my problem," he said flatly, his voice devoid of empathy. "Don't think for a second that you can use this to extort anything from me." Lucia's stomach churned with anger and humiliation, but she forced herself to stand, her knees unsteady, but her gaze unwavering. "I'm not asking for anything," she replied, her tone sharp despite the lump in her throat. "But you can't just walk away from this. You need to take responsibility for what you've done." Fernando let out a cold, bitter laugh, as if the word responsibility was a foreign concept to him. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Listen carefully, Lucia. I'm a powerful man. I can ruin you with a single phone call. If you so much as think about accusing me of anything, I'll make sure you'll never work another day in your life. Not only that, but I'll drag your family down with you. I'll make their lives hell." Lucia's blood ran cold. She froze, her body paralyzed by the sheer cruelty in his words. His threats were calculated and laced with an ease that left no doubt they were genuine. Her mind raced with questions. How could she protect her family from a man like this? How could she fight back without losing everything? The days that followed proved that Fernando's threats were anything but empty. He fired her under the guise of misconduct, accusing her of negligence and dishonesty in front of the other staff. When she tried to defend herself, his sharp, menacing glare silenced her. "You had the chance to leave quietly," he said, his voice chilling. "Now you'll deal with the consequences." Fernando wielded his influence like a weapon, ensuring that Lucia couldn't find work elsewhere. At every job interview, she was met with cold stares and quick rejections. It didn't take long for her to realize that he had destroyed her reputation before she could even explain herself. The whispers began soon after. Rumors of her supposed relationship with Fernando spread like wildfire, no doubt planted by him. Everywhere she went, she felt the weight of judgmental stares. Conversations stopped abruptly when she passed, and muffled laughter followed her through the streets. Lucia felt like a stranger in her own neighborhood, ostracized by the very community she once trusted. With no steady income and bills piling up, Lucia took whatever odd jobs she could find. Cleaning houses, running errands, anything to scrape by. But her earnings barely made a dent in the mounting expenses, and her savings dwindled quickly. The stress only deepened as her pregnancy progressed. Her mother began to notice the changes. Lucia's pale complexion, her lack of appetite, the sadness in her eyes. She asked questions, her concern growing by the day, but Lucia evaded every inquiry, too afraid to reveal the truth. She couldn't bring herself to burden her family with the nightmare she was living, especially when they already relied so heavily on her. Lucia carried her secret alone, the weight of it growing heavier with each passing day. The shadows of her past and the looming uncertainty of her future seemed to stretch endlessly before her, but she knew one thing for sure: she had to survive, for her family, for her child, for herself. One evening, as she sat alone in the kitchen, staring at a pile of overdue bills, Lucia felt the weight of her struggles crash down on her. She couldn't hold back anymore. Silent tears streamed down her face, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop them. Her thoughts were interrupted when Lucas wandered in, his innocent eyes wide with concern as he noticed her despair. "Lucia, what's wrong? Are you sick?" he asked, his voice filled with the sweet simplicity of a child's worry. Quickly wiping her tears, she pulled him into a tight hug, as though holding him could somehow shield them both from the harshness of reality. She didn't have the heart to explain her pain, didn't have the words to shatter his innocence with the brutal truths of their life. But even as she crumbled inside, Lucia knew one thing for sure: she couldn't give up. Her family depended on her, and with a baby on the way, her responsibilities had only grown. No matter how overwhelming it felt, she couldn't let the darkness win. From somewhere deep within, a flicker of determination began to burn. She promised herself she would find a way to survive, to shield her children from harm, and to ensure that Fernando Montero would never again hold the power to destroy her life. She refused to let him be the shadow that defined her existence. 10 years had passed since Lucia walked away from the Montero mansion. A decade of silent battles, of raising her daughter alone, of encountering closed doors and judgmental stares. The scars from her past, though invisible, had never truly faded. Her life had been marked by constant struggles, but through it all, Lucia had held firm to one truth: she wouldn't let Fernando Montero consume her. She had built a life for herself, but the echoes of her trauma still lingered. The nightmares came often, relentless reminders of a fear she couldn't quite shake. Fernando, though distant, remained a looming shadow. Even in the stability she had carved out for herself, the weight of her past clung to her heart. Then came the day when Valentina, now 9 years old, began to ask questions about the father she had never met, about the pieces of their story that didn't quite fit. Lucia knew this moment would come, but it still caught her off guard. One evening, as Lucia tucked her into bed, Valentina turned to her with curious eyes and asked, "Mum, why do you always look so sad when you talk about your old job?" The simple question pierced through Lucia's emotional armor. It was as if her daughter had unknowingly touched a wound she had been hiding for years. In that moment, Lucia realized she couldn't keep running from the truth. The silence she had clung to for so long was no longer enough. She owed it to Valentina and to herself to face her past head-on. Within days, Lucia made a decision that had been a decade in the making. She sat down with her mother, Teresa, to share her plan. Teresa, ever the steady presence in Lucia's life, listened quietly before gripping her daughter's hand with resolve. "It's been a long time, my girl," Teresa said, her voice firm. "But it's never too late to fight. I'm with you, always." Hearing those words, Lucia felt a strength she hadn't known in years. It wouldn't be easy. Fernando Montero was still a powerful man in Mexico City, and taking him on would require courage she wasn't sure she had. But one thing was clear: she wouldn't let herself remain a victim of his cruelty. Lucia was ready to fight, for Valentina, for herself, for the life they both deserved. Lucia's first step was reaching out to Cecilia, an old friend she had lost touch with over the years, but someone she had always trusted. When they finally reunited, Cecilia welcomed her back with the same warmth and unwavering support she had shown in the past. "I knew you'd do this one day, Lucia," Cecilia said, her voice filled with determination. "I'm with you. We're going to take this monster down together." Cecilia suggested they find a law firm that specialized in gender-based violence cases. After some searching, they came across Carolina Suarez, a lawyer known for her courage and willingness to take on tough cases, even when the opponent was someone powerful. When Lucia shared her story, Carolina listened carefully, jotting down notes, her eyes brimming with empathy. "Lucia, I know these 10 years have been anything but easy, but time doesn't erase what happened. We're going to fight for you," Carolina said, her voice filled with resolve. At Carolina's office, Lucia also met Rodrigo, a volunteer lawyer who worked on delicate cases like hers. Rodrigo was younger, but his seriousness and compassion won Lucia's trust quickly. He was deeply moved by Lucia's strength and told her gently, "Don't worry about the time that's passed. What matters now is that you're here, and we're going to make sure your voice is heard." Rodrigo didn't just dedicate himself to the case. He also helped Lucia with everyday tasks, like driving her to school on days when she had court hearings, and even helped out with small household chores. This kind of support made all the difference. For the first time in a long time, Lucia felt like she wasn't alone. With the support of Cecilia, Carolina, and Rodrigo, Lucia began to believe that she had a real shot at facing Fernando Montero. The road ahead was going to be tough, but now she had hope again, and the pain that once felt unbearable began to turn into strength. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Journalists crowded the entrance, cameras and microphones ready to catch every moment. Lucia's case against Fernando Montero had become a national sensation. To some, Lucia was a hero. To others, she was an opportunist trying to bring down a powerful man. But for Lucia, it was simple. She was searching for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd never had the chance to speak out. When the trial began, Fernando Montero maintained his usual arrogant stance, wearing a perfectly tailored suit. He presented himself as the victim, claiming that Lucia had fabricated the whole story in an attempt to gain money and fame. His legal team, among the best in the country, tried to discredit Lucia, painting her as a woman with dishonest intentions, trying to ruin the reputation of a powerful man. But Lucia wasn't there to be silenced. She knew the truth was on her side, and with the backing of her lawyers and friends, she was ready to confront Fernando Montero and the pain he had caused in her life. Carolina Suarez, Lucia's attorney, began her argument passionately, emphasizing how cases like Lucia's rarely make it to trial due to the power imbalance between the victim and the perpetrator. She stood tall, facing the jury, and declared firmly, "This case is not just about Lucia Fernandez and Fernando Montero. It's about the fight of women like her, whose voices are silenced by powerful men who think they can do whatever they want." Lucia, sitting next to Carolina, held her head high despite the weight of so many judgmental eyes on her. She knew the path ahead would be tough, but she was there, determined to make her voice heard. Rodrigo was there too, alongside Cecilia and her mother Teresa, always silent but unshakable in her unwavering support. Montero's defense came at her hard. His former employees, still under his influence, testified that Lucia had been a problematic worker and that the long delay in reporting the abuse only proved her accusations were false. One of his lawyers, speaking provocatively, asked, "If what Ms. Fernandez is saying is true, why did she wait 10 years to take action?" Lucia took a deep breath before responding, her voice steady, though the fear still lingered in her heart. "Because I was scared. He made me believe there was no way out, but I'm here now because my daughter deserves to know that her mother is stronger than any threat." Her words hung in the air, and for a brief moment the courtroom fell silent. But Montero, cold as ever, vehemently denied all the allegations. He portrayed himself as an innocent man, simply defending his reputation against a baseless extortion attempt. Yet the way he avoided looking directly at Lucia only weakened the impenetrable image he was trying to create. Then, something unexpected happened. A woman named Vanessa, around 30 years old, offered to testify. Carolina had reached out to several women who had worked for Fernando Montero, hoping to find others with similar experiences. But up until that point, none had been willing to speak out. When Vanessa took the stand and shared her story, it was a devastating blow to Montero's defense. With a trembling voice, Vanessa told her story. She had worked at the Montero estate 5 years after Lucia and had endured similar suffering. Fernando's methods of manipulation and coercion were undeniable. Vanessa explained that she had remained silent for years out of fear, but seeing Lucia's courage made it impossible for her to carry the burden alone anymore. "Lucia gave me the strength to speak," Vanessa told the jury. "I don't want to stay silent anymore." Vanessa's testimony hit Montero's defense hard. For the first time, the carefully constructed narrative by his lawyers began to unravel. Carolina seized the moment, pointing out the pattern of abuse and manipulation Fernando had inflicted over the years. The truth was finally being exposed. In the following days, Lucia finally had her chance to tell her story. With a steady voice yet filled with emotion, she recounted the events that had changed her life. She spoke of the years of silence, but also about her daughter, Valentina, and how it was for her that she found the strength to fight. "For a long time, I thought I was to blame," Lucia said, looking directly at Fernando. "But now I know the only person to blame is sitting right there." Her gaze locked with Montero's. For the first time, he looked away, as if somehow his strength had been shattered. Lucia noticed some jurors with tear-filled eyes, others visibly shocked. Rodrigo stood watching, fists clenched, a silent sign of support. Vanessa, in the audience, couldn't hold back her tears as she listened to Lucia, who was now speaking not just for herself, but for all of them. Outside the courtroom, Lucia's case had become a media phenomenon. Social media was buzzing with discussions about abuse of power, with countless women sharing their own stories of harassment and injustice. Though Lucia was overwhelmed by the attention, she began to realize that her fight had become bigger than herself. Her story was inspiring other women to find their voices, and that gave her an extra surge of strength. When the final arguments were presented, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. Carolina highlighted the bravery of both Lucia and Vanessa, emphasizing how, despite all the odds, they had stood strong. "Justice is not just about punishing the guilty," Carolina said to the jury. "It's about restoring the dignity of the victims and sending a clear message. No one is above the law, not even Fernando Montero." At the start of the trial, Montero had been confident, but as Lucia and Vanessa took the stand, telling their stories, his composure started to crack. His defense kept trying to downplay the damage, but the impact of the witnesses was undeniable. That afternoon, as Lucia left the courtroom with Rodrigo by her side and her mother holding her hand, she knew that no matter what the final verdict was, she had already gained something priceless. Her voice had been heard, and, perhaps even more importantly, she had sparked a change that could never be ignored. The room fell silent as the judge began to read the verdict. Each word seemed to echo in Lucia's mind. slow and rhythmic, like the beat of a drum. She squeezed Rodrigo's hand, her heart racing as she waited for the decision that would alter her life forever. Then, the judge's voice broke through the silence. On all charges presented, the defendant, Fernando Montero, is found guilty. He is ordered to pay a substantial compensation to the victim, Lucia Fernandez. The weight of the decision hit Lucia like a wave of relief, and it was only then that she realized tears were streaming down her face. Rodrigo gently squeezed her hand, offering a quiet smile full of pride. Vanessa, sitting at the back of the room, smiled too, but her teary eyes spoke volumes. Fernando Montero, who had once seemed untouchable, now appeared small in the courtroom. He sat motionless, refusing to look at Lucia or anyone else, his mask of arrogance finally crumbling. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters and supporters waited eagerly. When Lucia appeared, she was met with applause and encouraging words. The attention was overwhelming, but she held her head high, feeling for the first time in many years that she had regained control of her life. "This victory is not just mine," she told the reporters, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's for all the women who suffer in silence. I hope my story shows them they're not alone and that it's worth fighting for justice." Rodrigo stood by her side, his presence steady but unwavering. With the compensation she received from the case, Lucia began to rebuild her life. The first step was to find a safer home for her family. They moved into a simple, cozy house, far from the neighborhood where judgmental eyes constantly followed them. For the first time, Lucia felt she was giving her mother, Teresa, and her daughter, Valentina, the stability and security they had always deserved. Inspired by her mother's journey, Valentina decided to open a cafe in a cozy neighborhood. But this wouldn't just be any cafe. Valentina envisioned it as a sanctuary, somewhere more than just a place to grab a coffee. She wanted it to be a haven for women, a spot where they could find support, warmth, and new opportunities. The walls were decorated with paintings carrying empowering messages, and the atmosphere was inviting, filled with hope and comfort. At the same time, Valentina was studying psychology. She knew firsthand the impact trauma can have on a person's life, and she was determined to use her experience to help other women face their own struggles and rewrite their stories. "I don't just want to survive what happened to me," she said to Rodrigo one night. "I want to turn it into something that makes a real difference." Over time, the bond between Lucia and Rodrigo grew even stronger. He wasn't just her biggest supporter during the trial. He had become a rock in her life, a constant emotional anchor. Rodrigo treated Valentina with such care and patience, gradually winning her heart. From the beginning, Valentina had called him Uncle Rodrigo, but over time he became much more than that. "Do you think it would be strange if I called you Dad?" Rodrigo asked Valentina one day, his voice soft and full of affection. The 10-year-old girl wrapped her arms around him, her embrace full of innocence and love. That simple, heartfelt hug sealed Rodrigo's place in her life. He hadn't just helped rebuild Lucia's world, he had become an inseparable part of it in a way no one could have ever predicted. As the months passed, the cafe flourished. Women from all walks of life came, not just for the delicious coffee, but to share their stories and seek support. The cafe became a meeting place, where psychologists, lawyers, and other professionals volunteered their time to provide free services to women in vulnerable situations. Valentina was surrounded by love and stability, with Lucia being her biggest source of inspiration. In addition to helping out at the cafe, Valentina would charm customers with her bright smile and warm hugs. Teresa, now healthy and strong, enjoyed helping with the little details, feeling an immense sense of pride as she watched her daughter transform pain into something so beautiful. Lucia and Rodrigo chose to make their bond official with an intimate ceremony, surrounded only by close family and friends. For Lucia, this wedding wasn't the start of something new, but rather the continuation of everything she had fought for. Rodrigo had become an integral part of who she was and all that she had become. One afternoon, as Lucia was closing up the cafe, she paused to look at the sky, a peaceful smile spreading across her face. Although the past still left its scars, she knew she had overcome it all. Her story was no longer just about pain and suffering. It was one of strength, resilience, and transformation. When she arrived home, she found Valentina studying and Rodrigo preparing dinner. That simple scene, small as it seemed, was everything Lucia had always dreamed of, a home filled with love and endless possibilities. Watching the family she had built, she whispered to herself, "I did it." Years went by, and Lucia Fernandez had transformed into a woman whose strength and resilience inspired everyone around her. She didn't just rewrite her own story. She helped countless other women find the courage to rewrite theirs. The little cafe she had started as a humble spot for coffee had over time become a true support center for women. It was more than just a place to grab a drink. It offered comfort, legal guidance, psychological support, and even job training courses. It had become a refuge of hope, a safe haven where women could find the strength to rebuild their lives after trauma. Lucia, Rodrigo, and Valentina formed a strong, united network built on love. At 15, Valentina had blossomed into a confident young woman, inspired by her mother's unwavering courage. Adriana, Lucia's sister, had graduated in law and became a dedicated attorney specializing in domestic violence cases, often working in collaboration with the support center. Lucia's brother, Lucas, was in his final year of medical school, with dreams of becoming a pediatrician. He visited the center frequently, bringing not only funny stories from his patients, but also moments of lightheartedness and humor that brightened the atmosphere. Everything seemed to finally be in place, until one day, Lucia received an unexpected call. It was from her lawyer, informing her that Fernando Montero, the man who had once held so much power over her, was gravely ill and wanted to see her. After discussing it with Rodrigo and Adriana, Lucia decided she would go, not for him, but for herself. It would be her final chance to close that painful chapter of her life for good. When Lucia arrived at the hospital, Fernando Montero was a mere shadow of the man who had once terrorized her. His voice was frail. His eyes, though tinged with regret, still carried a hint of the arrogance he had once worn like armor. "I want to ask for your forgiveness," he whispered with difficulty. "I know I've made mistakes. I can't undo what I've done, but I want to fix what I still can." He offered part of his inheritance to Valentina, a gesture Lucia reluctantly accepted, but with one firm condition: her daughter would never know of their connection. "This isn't for you," Lucia said, her eyes filled with unshakable resolve. "This is to ensure my daughter's future is free from everything you represent." As Lucia left the hospital, she felt an unexpected sense of relief. It wasn't the feeling of reconciliation or full redemption, but it was closure. Those final words marked the end of a painful chapter in her life. Months later, Lucia and Rodrigo made their commitment official in an intimate ceremony, surrounded by family, friends, and women whose lives Lucia had touched over the years. They exchanged simple yet deeply meaningful vows. Valentina stood proudly as the flower girl, while Adriana and Lucas moved everyone with heartfelt speeches. Adriana, with tears in her eyes, spoke, "You're the reason we never gave up, Lucia. Now we can chase our dreams because you showed us how." When Rodrigo slipped the ring onto Lucia's finger, he smiled and said, "I promise to stand by your side through every battle and every victory." The ceremony, simple yet filled with love, reflected everything Lucia had fought for: resilience, love, and a strong, united community. With the inheritance from Montero and the success of the cafe, Lucia decided to expand her mission. The cafe transformed into a full-fledged support center for women, offering shelter, empowerment workshops, therapy, and legal advice. Women from all over the city came seeking help, all inspired by Lucia's incredible journey. Lucia also wrote a book about her life titled Beyond the Pain, My Fight for Justice and Hope. It was an immediate success, symbolizing strength and overcoming adversity. At speaking engagements and events, Lucia shared her story, urging other women to find their voice and rise above their struggles. One sunny afternoon, the cafe buzzed with energy. Lucia watched Valentina serving customers, her bright smile lighting up the room, just as it always had. Rodrigo sat in a corner reading a book, while Teresa, now healthy and vibrant, arranged fresh flowers for the tables. Adriana walked in, portfolio in hand, and Lucas, wearing his white coat, came straight from the hospital. The space was filled with laughter and chatter. It was a simple scene, but for Lucia, it held immense meaning. Looking around at her family, Lucia felt a wave of gratitude and fulfillment. All the challenges, struggles, and hardships had led her to this moment. She had turned pain into strength and her fight into a legacy that would never be forgotten. Did you enjoy today's story? Then make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like and share it with your friends. We'll see you in the next video.